The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the dense forest as Ethan wandered through the woods near his small town. It was a place he had visited countless times, a peaceful escape from the pressures of school, family, and the usual teenage drama. But today felt different. The air seemed heavier, as if something unseen lurked just beyond the trees. The soft rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird were the only sounds, but they weren't as comforting as they usually were. There was an eerie silence that clung to the air, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He kicked at a patch of dirt, not paying much attention to where he was walking, when his foot caught on something hard. Ethan stumbled, falling to his knees. Irritated, he looked down and saw the corner of something wooden sticking out of the ground. Curious, he began to dig with his hands, pulling away the loose soil until he unearthed an old weathered box. The wood was rotting in places, and the metal hinges were rusted over. Heart racing with excitement, Ethan pried it open, the lid creaking as if it hadn't been touched in decades. Inside was a single item, a leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked and worn, and the pages yellowed with age. It looked ancient, far older than anything Ethan had ever seen. He brushed off the dirt, intrigued by what might be inside. With a mixture of hesitation and curiosity, Ethan opened it and began to read. The handwriting was shaky and uneven, as if the person writing had been in a hurry or under duress. The first few entries seemed harmless, though strange. They were written by someone named Samuel and spoke of the woods, this very same forest, and a deep, unsettling obsession with the darkness that dwelled within it. Samuel wrote about hearing whispers at night, seeing shadows that weren't there, and feeling an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the trees themselves were watching him. Ethan furrowed his brow. This was clearly some sort of old diary, but the further he read, the more disturbing it became. Samuel wrote about seeing a figure in the woods, always just out of sight, always watching him from the shadows. He began to describe gruesome scenes, detailing murders that occurred deep in the forest. People he knew, friends and strangers alike, all meeting horrific ends, throats slashed, bodies mutilated, blood soaking the ground. Ethan's heart began to pound as he flipped through the pages. The killings Samuel described were disturbingly vivid, too detailed to be pure imagination. There were names, dates, places, all of them within the woods, all eerily close to where Ethan had found the journal. The more he read, the more the entries shifted from descriptions of murders to frantic, desperate scribblings. Samuel wrote about how the killings weren't just random acts of violence. No, they were part of something larger, something dark and ancient. He wrote about how the forest was alive, how it fed on the fear and the blood of the innocent. As Ethan turned the pages, his stomach churned with unease. Samuel's words became more erratic, scrawled in a frantic hand, almost illegible. He claimed that he wasn't the one committing the murders, but someone was using him, controlling him. He wrote about waking up in the woods, covered in blood, with no memory of how he got there. He begged whoever found the journal to stop reading, to leave it buried where it belonged. Ethan's fingers trembled as he closed the journal. He glanced around. The once familiar woods now seemed menacing. The trees towered over him, casting dark shadows that danced in the fading light. The forest, which had always been a place of solitude, now felt suffocating. The journal's last words echoed in his mind. Stop reading. Leave it buried. But it was just a story, right? Some kind of old horror fiction written by a disturbed mind, probably decades ago. And yet, something about the journal felt too real, too unsettling to dismiss. Ethan shoved it into his backpack and hurried home, trying to shake the feeling of eyes watching him from the trees. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, his mind replaying the gruesome details of the journal. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside sent his heart racing. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and he drifted into a restless sleep. But his dreams were filled with nightmarish images, bloody bodies, shadowy figures lurking in the woods, and the sensation of being hunted. The next morning, Ethan woke with a start drenched in sweat. The unsettling images from the journal still lingered in his mind. He tried to shake it off, telling himself it was just a story, nothing more. But as he scrolled through his phone, a headline caught his eye. Local man found dead in the woods. Body mutilated. Ethan's blood ran cold. The location of the body was exactly where Samuel had described one of the murders in the journal. Heart pounding, Ethan grabbed the journal from his backpack and flipped to the entry that matched the description. The details were the same, The man, the location, even the manner of death. It was impossible. There was no way this could be real. But it was. As the day went on, Ethan tried to put the pieces together, but nothing made sense. The journal was old, the ink faded in places. There was no way it could have predicted something that just happened. And yet, the more he thought about it, the more he couldn't shake the feeling that the journal wasn't just a piece of fiction. It was a warning. Over the next few days, more deaths were reported. Each one matched the entries in the journal, down to the smallest detail. Ethan's fear grew with each passing hour. The journal wasn't just predicting the murders, it was controlling them. And worse, it seemed to be drawing closer to him. One night, as he sat in his room, poring over the journal for the 100th time, he noticed something he hadn't before. The latest entry wasn't written by Samuel. The handwriting was different, neater, more precise. And the date was today. It detailed a new murder, one that hadn't happened yet. The description was horrifying, more brutal than any of the previous killings. But what made Ethan's heart stop was the name. It was his own. Ethan's hands shook violently as he stared at the page, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. The journal had predicted everything so far, every gruesome detail, every death. And now it was coming for him. Panic set in. He slammed the journal shut and threw it across the room, as if that would somehow make it stop, as if ignoring it would break the curse. But deep down, he knew it was too late. The journal had been waiting for someone to find it, to read its twisted words. And now, it had him in its grasp. The night stretched on, the air thick with dread. Ethan barricaded himself in his room, every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind outside making his skin crawl. He kept glancing at the journal, now lying on the floor where he had thrown it, as if it were alive, waiting for him to pick it up again. Suddenly there was a knock at the door. Ethan froze, heart pounding in his chest. The knock came again, louder this time. He slowly stood, inching toward the door. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling. No answer. Another knock, harder, more insistent. Ethan's mind raced. It couldn't be real. This was just some sick coincidence, a twisted game his mind was playing on him. But as he reached for the doorknob, he felt a cold chill crawl down his spine. Something wasn't right. He flung the door open, half expecting to see a shadowy figure standing in the hall. But there was no one there. Just the empty hallway, dimly lit by the flickering light from the street outside. Then he saw it, a single piece of paper lying on the floor just outside the door. It was old, yellowed, the edges frayed. Ethan picked it up, his hands trembling. It was a page from the journal. But this page wasn't about a murder, it was about him. It described everything he had done, everything he had felt since finding the journal. The fear, the panic, the sense of being watched. Every word was written with terrifying precision, as if the journal itself had been documenting his every move. And at the bottom of the page, scrawled in shaky handwriting, were two words: "You're next." Ethan dropped the page, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He ran to the window, pulling back the curtains, half expecting to see someone, something, waiting for him in the shadows. But the street was empty, the night silent. Then the knocking started again. This time, it wasn't at the door. It was coming from the walls. Ethan's blood turned to ice. He stumbled back, his mind racing. The sound grew louder, closer, as if something or someone was trying to break through the walls themselves. Desperate, he grabbed the journal, flipping through the pages, searching for some kind of explanation, some way to stop whatever was happening. But the pages had changed. Every entry was gone, replaced by one single sentence repeated over and over again: "You can't escape." The knocking grew more violent, the walls shaking as if they were about to give way. Ethan screamed, backing into a corner, clutching the journal to his chest as if it could somehow protect him. But deep down, he knew it was futile. The journal had taken control, and now whatever it had unleashed was coming for him. The walls began to crack, thin lines spreading like cobwebs, the sound of splintering wood and groaning plaster, growing louder with each passing second. Ethan's heart raced as he watched in horror. The force on the other side of the wall was trying to break through, and it was succeeding. His mind was spinning, desperately searching for a way out. He had to escape, had to find a way to stop this. His eyes darted around the room, frantically seeking an exit, a weapon, anything. The only thing that stood out was the journal, its pages fluttering slightly as if alive, as if waiting for him to do something. Then, A memory flashed through his mind. The last entry. Face it. Finish it. Ethan's breath hitched. Was this some kind of sick riddle? What did face it mean? How could he finish something so terrifying, so beyond comprehension? But he had no other choice. Whatever was coming for him wasn't going to stop. Gathering every ounce of courage, Ethan stood up, gripping the journal tightly in his trembling hands. His pulse thundered in his ears as he slowly made his way toward the center of the room, where the cracks in the walls grew wider, jagged edges curling inward like the maw of a beast ready to swallow him whole. The air in the room grew colder, his breath now visible in the frigid atmosphere. The shadowy figure began to emerge through the cracks. It was tall and looming, its form twisting unnaturally as it stepped from the shattered wall into the room. Its eyes, two glowing, malevolent orbs, fixed on Ethan, freezing him in place. The figure was covered in a dark, swirling mist, its shape barely human. It radiated an overwhelming sense of dread, an ancient and unearthly force that made Ethan's skin crawl. The figure reached toward him with long, clawed fingers, the cold radiating from it enough to freeze the very air between them. But Ethan knew what he had to do now. The journal. It wanted him to write. It wanted him to finish the story. With shaking hands, Ethan flipped open the journal, finding the last blank page. His heart pounded in his chest as he stared at it, the pen in his hand feeling heavier than ever. He knew instinctively that the words he wrote next would determine whether he lived or died. Without thinking too much, he put pen to paper and began to write, his hand guided by something beyond his control. The shadow moved toward him, its eyes burning with hunger, ready to claim its next victim. But the boy knew the truth now. He knew how to stop it. The only way to end this nightmare was to face it, to accept that this story was never meant to be told. It was not his fate to die here, not his end to be written. Ethan's hand moved faster now, the pen scratching furiously against the paper. The figure grew closer, its cold presence pressing down on him like a weight, but he kept writing, his words coming faster. The boy understood that the journal was the source, the anchor for the evil that had terrorized those before him. To break free, he had to finish the story, not with fear, but with an end that severed its control. He turned, faced the darkness, and declared the truth. Before Ethan could even comprehend what he was doing, he wrote the final sentence. "You have no power over me." As soon as the words were written, something shifted. The figure stopped in its tracks, its glowing eyes flickering for the briefest moment. The temperature in the room began to rise, the oppressive cold lifting. Ethan could feel the journal growing warm in his hands, as if the very act of finishing the sentence had broken whatever hold it had on him. The figure hissed, an unnatural sound that reverberated through the room. Its form started to blur, the dark mist swirling faster around it, disintegrating as if being pulled apart from within. The walls that had cracked and crumbled began to repair themselves, the floor solidifying beneath Ethan's feet. He watched in stunned silence as the figure's outlines slowly dissolved into the air, vanishing like smoke in the wind. The journal, now glowing faintly in his hands, began to heat up even more. He could feel the energy inside it building to an unbearable intensity. Without a second thought, Ethan knew what he had to do. He crossed the room to the fireplace, his legs still trembling with fear but his resolve firm. He opened the grate, the flames crackling softly inside, and threw the journal into the fire. The moment it hit the flames, the book erupted in a flash of light, a final defiant burst of energy before it was consumed entirely. The pages curled and blackened, the words that had once tormented him reduced to ash. Ethan watched as the fire continued to burn, brighter and stronger than before, as if it were purging the last remnants of the dark power from the journal. The room, once filled with an oppressive, suffocating energy, now felt lighter, cleaner. The air no longer felt thick with malice, and the house itself seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. It was over. Ethan collapsed onto the floor, his body shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline. He stared into the fire, watching the last of the journal turn to dust. The nightmare was finally behind him, and for the first time in days, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. But as he sat there, something caught his eye. A single page, untouched by the flames, fluttered gently to the ground at the edge of the hearth. Ethan's blood ran cold. The page was pristine, untouched by the fire's heat, its edges crisp and white. With trembling hands, he picked it up. On it, written in the same shaky handwriting, were 3 words. "It's not over." Ethan's heart stopped. His fingers tightened around the page as the cold dread crept back into his chest. He looked back at the fire, now burning low, and then at the page in his hands. The journal was gone, but the story wasn't finished. And deep down, Ethan knew the nightmare was far from over.